The Creative Mystic, Chapter 3, The Urge to Write, of an Author's Tale. Last video, we talked about some of my past and all those books that I read. Well, today I want to talk to you about how I took all that and condensed it into and shaped it into an actual writing, a manuscript. So actually, it has its roots in Terry Goodkind's stories. And he had a character in there that I felt like really needed to have a little more, be a little more fleshed out, create a story around him. So that was my first attempt, is to give him a story. It never went anywhere. I had a friend read it and she said it was totally boring. So I was like, okay, shelve that one. In the meantime, I had been studying Akashic records and because of the psoriasis, to back up 1 minute, because of the psoriasis, I have studied all sorts of healing modalities from Western medicine, anatomy and physiology, to herbs, to then that wasn't working. So I studied into Eastern, like traditional Chinese medicine, and studied how that works, the five elements. I like the five elements because it's a simple way, a relatable way to interpret the world, interpret people, interpret me. And that didn't really go anywhere. So I started getting into energy medicine. I became a Reiki master. Um, Took a lot of different classes. I got my massage license and just kept studying and kept studying and kept studying. But none of the really healing methods really seemed to help me much. So I thought, okay, if it's not in my body, it must be in my head and in my spirit. So let's start delving into that. So I started studying into the Akashic records, and which is where your soul history is kept. And from there, it's like the soul is sort of like the master, and it's what animates this body. And theoretically, if we are following and are aligned with ourselves, we are following our soul's purpose, which is basically to express itself and who it is and what it is. Took me a while to figure that one out. But so I learned about that. And then from there, that graduated into astronumerology and astrology and numerology and human design. Well, and then in the meantime, I'm still working on health because there's got to be a connection here between the mind and the body and the spirit and the mind and the body. I was beginning to realize there's a link. And I didn't know how to put it together yet. So I had been listening to Dr. Alberto Vallado, who was talking about more like Peruvian shamanism, but he was talking about how the shamans are able to see the future because they believe that between the breaths, where there is that stillness, time stops. And from there, you can go forward or backward or wherever you want to go. And also, I had been listening to Dr. Joe Dispenza, and he was talking about how he healed a spinal injury by imagining the vertebrae were all healed and all in alignment and all just perfectly the way they were supposed to be. And he imagined that for 42 days before it started to actually show up signs where the doctors started saying, oh, you're starting to heal. So I thought, well, my mind was awash with all this information, human design, astrology, Akashic records, my soul purpose, my soul profile, where am I at, the challenges, all these built-in challenges that I had. And it's like, who am I? How does somebody with all this configuration what kind of a life would they be? What would they be doing? And so I thought, after I listened to these, I thought, well, I am going to write for 42 days and about who am I becoming and see what happens. So that night, after I decided that, I had this dream where usually I have a lot of dreams, but usually I don't remember them really well. But this one I remembered really well. And it had this little, these characters in it, and they were kind of bickering back and forth. And they were also trying to go for this goal and wanted to get this or that. And I thought, I can use this. So I sat down and I started writing. I wrote down the dream first, and then I started expanding it. And every day I was only going to write for like 20 minutes or half an hour, but some days turned into 2 or 3 or 4 hours. I'd disappear in the back room here, my massage room. And so uh I filled up one, I wrote it out by hand, and I filled up one, notebook, and then I started on the next one, and I started in the middle, and then I kind of moved forward, and then I went back and wrote the beginning. And I was so proud of myself. I wrote for 42 days, and so I read through it and was like, oh yes, this is really cool. And I transcribed it to the computer and edited a little bit and rearranged it and filled out a few details. And I was so proud of myself. It's like, oh yes, I really have something here. And so I sent it to my friend. And he sent back, he said, interesting story. And I was like, okay, what does that mean? So I asked him to give me more details. He said, well, it really should be broken up into about 3 books. And you need to explain why people are doing what they're doing. I was like, uh-oh. So I realized that uh, I had to lick my deflated wounds for a few little bit. And I thought, okay, fine. I'm going to go back to this. I had gotten a writing coach for a book for the Terry Good kind of book that I was going to work on. I didn't like that. So I had actually rewritten a new story. And I'd started working with this writing coach, developmental editor. And she taught me all the things I didn't know about writing. I mean, I was really green. And what I thought, I mean, I did good in English in high school. I did really good at English. But being good at English and and crafting a narrative that somebody is going to be interested in is a whole different story. So she helped me start getting an idea about writing. And I worked with her for about a year on this other book, which eventually, once I finish this series, I'll go back into that series and rewrite it. And so it's also about a spirit woman. And so she taught me about some of the rudimentary things that you need to do as an author. So I went back to her with my creation here, my newly revised book about who am I becoming. And so we started working together. And she read it and she says, what do you want to do with this? Do you want to just keep it for your own memento? Or do you want to share this with the world? And I said, well, it's a little scary, but yeah, because it was pretty kind of personal. When you write, especially when you're doing this creative writing, it comes from you. And you is made up of all sorts of wants and desires and experiences, and you mix them all up, but they still come out. Your secrets come out, even if you aren't aware of it. So I learned that too. So I said, well, yeah, it would be nice to publish this, to turn this into a story. So she says, okay. So we worked on it. And it went from being this really rough draft first draft. So we went through several iterations of point of view, first person, third person, and how many points of view. At one point, there were 4 points of view. And she said, that's too many. People will pick one and they won't want to read the others. It's like, okay. And then we went from first person to third person. She says, no, the third person just doesn't grab you. So I was like, fine. So I wrote first person as for Ilar, who's the healer, who's the protagonist. Excuse me. And first person for Roken, the sorcerer, who is the bad guy. Well, that was a challenge because how do you get into somebody's head to write like he would think? It was easy to be in Ilar's head because she's kind of like a representation of me. So we worked through that, and I totally rewrote the whole thing 4 times, and finally it clicked, and I started working. Finally, I got the current story that I'm working with, and we had to work on the flow and everything. So that took a certain amount of diligence. It took me about a year, maybe a little more than a year of back and forth to finally come up with a version that would work. She told me all sorts of, because, as you're writing, part of the writing journey, especially when you're starting, is it's sort of like, who is writing? Is it the little girl writing? Is it the mature adult writing? Or somebody in between? Or a combination of the two? And so that's where a really good developmental editor really helps, because she will help point out, your character is supposed to be 42 years old and she's acting like a teenager. I was like, oops. And it was things like that she would point out. And then she would be doing some inappropriate actions, and she'd point those out. And so it's like the first few drafts, I think I had, before it finally got published, I had like 25 revisions or something like that. And the first few drafts is really, especially as a new writer, is just getting out stuff that you've stored away inside that you've never released before. And it'll be pretty surprising, and it can be pretty scary, and heaven forbid that anybody else read it, because this is way too personal. So in the next video, I'll tell you some of those very personal, scary situations. So be sure and subscribe so you don't miss it. I will see you in the next video.